Hi, my name is Fay Melton Arendall. I have lived in Gwinnett County for all of my 82 years, except for 8 months. I was born in Barrow County, just across the road from Harbin's community, a small farming community near Decula. It was actually, we moved there when I was 8 months old, and it was actually home to both my mother and father and a lot of kinfolks and a lot of first cousins. So I want to say that it's an honor to be able to share these memories of the good old days. It's important to me to preserve the way life was back then, because I've always been interested in history, and life is so different now from what it was back then. In fact, I wrote a book entitled The Way It Was Back Then, because it seemed our simple way of life was slipping away fast.
Hi, I'm Donna. Yes, obviously, I'm here to ask Mama about those good old days. What was it like growing up in rural Gwinnett, Mama?
It was an adventure. In our community, it was mostly a farming community, and houses were fairly close together, but not like subdivisions are now. And neighbors were really neighbors. We had to work hard. I mean, I was the youngest of 5, so I didn't have to work in the field till later. But our main crop in the farming community was cotton. And cotton is a lot of hard work. You plant it, you have to hoe the weeds out, you have to get it ready, and then the picking is not easy. And most everybody did have to pick cotton. And even there was, in Gwinnett County, there was so much farming country that we would start to school in September and then get out 2 weeks later for 2 weeks just to pick cotton. And if your family didn't own a farm and they worked at public work, the kids would make extra money picking for somebody else. So
What other crops did you raise?
we had corn. Daddy grew a lot of corn. We had wheat, and the thrashing crew would come through every year, and they would do a community at a time, which called for a lot of cooking on the women's part. But we carried the corn, of course, was for fodder for the livestock, but we also carried the corn and the wheat to a mill in Brazelton, and this was our corn mill and flour. About all we had to buy at a store in town was sugar and coffee and items of this nature. Everything else was grown at home.
But it was harder because you didn't have some of the conveniences we have now.
No, we didn't have electricity. We didn't have phones. We didn't have indoor plumbing, hence the outhouse. And it was hard work, but we had orchards. We had apples and peaches and strawberries. We had a lot of good eating.
You mentioned your neighbors. You told me one time about an incident in our family where the neighbors really came together to help your grandma.
Yeah, my grandmother's house burned. She was a widow woman, and the community built her a 4-room house furnished the lumber, furnished the labor, and so they all just came together to people took care of each other then. And you didn't just know somebody next door or somebody across the street. You knew the whole community. I mean, I could go down the road right now in Harbin's and remember the houses, the people that lived in them, and name all the kids. And I guess I was in most of them at one time or another. And so,
With all that hard work, what did you do for fun?
oh, we had a good time.
Or did you have any fun?
Yes, yes, we had a lot of company. We had a lot of kinfolks. We had a lot of spend the night company. But we had one of the first radios in the community. I still remember how it looks. It was curved over and had a cloth-like front. And people would come, a lot of people, on Saturday night to hear the Grand Ole Opry. And in the summertime, we would make maybe 3 or 4 freezers of ice cream.
Yum.
And the kids always played. We played hide and seek. We always had somebody to play with. But we loved to sit on the front porch and listen to the older folks tell their tall tales. And so it was just a good time. I mean, people really intermixed with each other. And if someone was sick, people carried food. I mean, it was just, barring the picking cotton in the outhouse, so those simple times would be great today.
Well, you did tell me about a time when you got in trouble with your playthings.
Well, I was the youngest. I was the baby. So, and our paper dolls were not bought. They were cut out of Sears Roebuck catalog. And my sisters were older. They would fix a place playing with they would fix cars out of shoe boxes and things like that. And they wouldn't let me play with them one time, and I guess now they told this on me, I don't remember it, but they said that I got mad at them, and I poked all their paper dolls down a knot hole in the floor.
So you ended up getting in trouble. You did also tell me about a special toy that your brothers gave you.
Yes, after my brothers went to work, my oldest one was 16 years older than me. So the first thing they did, they brought me after they went to work, it was for a Christmas present, was a tricycle. And that was really something back then. It was, I really thought I was in hog heaven.
But you're talking about all that company. I also know from things you've told me that there was a certain event that your family always looked forward to every year when you came together.
Family reunions.
Family reunions.
Yes, we had, as I said, we were close. The kinfolks were close, and we went to Grandma's a lot, and my father's parents had to start living with children off and on. But my Grandma Clark, we walked across the field and down the road, and we went there for Mother's Day. We went there for Christmas. We went there, and it was my mother and father was one of 13. So I had cousins galore, and we looked forward to those reunions, and they were all good cooks. I mean, my mom was an excellent cook, and back then Brunswick stew was the order of the day for any kind of reunion. But they couldn't do it ahead of time. They had to bring in canned meat, canned hog's head, and they had to bring canned vegetables, and it had to be ground and cooked after we all congregated. So the women folks still had a lot to do, but a lot of talking went on too.
Well, even I remember family reunions. I don't go all the way back to the hog's head part, but I do remember family reunions and how important food was. And but it didn't come from the grocery store.
No.
How did all that happen?
Well, we grew everything. We grew everything, and we always had plenty of meat. I was born at the end of the Depression, so things were already coming around. But even during the Great Depression, people in the country were not affected if they had a place to live like the people in the city. We killed like maybe three hogs a winter, and when we did kill hogs, it was a community. You helped each other, and then you would go home with fresh meat, and then when you helped the other families, you came home with fresh meat. But Daddy was so good at sugar curing hams. We had fatback and sausage. I mean, sausage, Mom would have a very clean, big old tin tub, and she had her homegrown peppers and stuffed sage and stuff to put in it. So she would can some of it, but some of it she would flatten out and put in a cheesecloth and then make homemade paste and take brown paper and wrap it up. And that would cure, and it was a taste different from anything. We call it sack sausage, and it was something that we don't have today.
When you talk about I remember Gran Melton's good cooking, but it amazes me how she had to cook when you were growing up. She didn't turn a dial to set the temperature on the stove.
She had to cook on a wood stove, but she knew how to do all of it. You know, she was just so used to it. And one of my jobs when I was little was to bring in the stove wood. Of course, that stands for stove wood. There was a big box close to the stove, and that was my job to bring in the stove wood to keep it going.
And you had to. How did they preserve the food? I know you mentioned canning. There weren't freezers. So.
No, we didn't have anything like that. Mom had. She would can maybe 200 cans of vegetables, jams and jellies, and blackberry vines were beside the road in the pasture. They were all over running, growing wild, which you don't see them now. But she canned everything, and we didn't have any way to keep it other than that, except we did have a cellar that a hole dug down in the ground, deep, as tall as my dad's head, and that's where we kept butter and eggs and things that did have to have coolness. And but later on, we did get an ice box, and the iceman would run once a week, so you had to be ready to watch for him to make sure he stopped, and that would go in an ice box, a big block of ice, and then, there was compartments to keep things in then. But of course it still wasn't frozen, it was just keeping them cool. But if we made ice cream, if we knew we was gonna make ice cream on Saturday night, we would buy extra ice, and Daddy would put it in a burlap sack and bury it down in the cotton house under the cottonseed to keep it, so it wouldn't melt, so we could have it to make ice cream.
Well, all that talk about family and food, I can imagine the holidays were quite eventful at your house.
Well, anything we got then, or anything we got to do, we really appreciated. I mean, it was just, because there was not that much stuff, we only got maybe one toy, and we got an orange and a tangerine or something, because you only got that during Christmas. You didn't have stuff like that all year. But it was so exciting, and our Christmas tree wasn't that big of an event because, well, I think we used cedar trees and they smelled good, but all we had to decorate them with was popcorn strung on thread and the little construction paper that we made little balls to string around. So but it was all so exciting.
Well, you
And-
did have something special at Christmas that I can remember, and that was Gran's cakes.
Yes, Mama made tea cakes all year long. She had tea cakes, and she kept them wrapped in a flour sack. And so that wasn't a novelty to have cookies on Christmas, but she would make stack cakes, chocolate, jam cake, cream cake with raisins and pecans, and fresh coconut cake. And that was really something because you had to buy the coconut, and Dad had to take a hammer and do in the eyes of the coconut to drain the coconut milk out. Then he would have to bust it all up with a hammer, and you'd have to trim all that off. So that was really a job. And so it was so special
I'm
to
sure y'all
have that.
appreciated her doing that.
But-
That's a lot of work.
She always had to do stack cakes because pound cake pans and sheet cake pans weren't available during that time.
Well, I know you have told the story many times about a very eventful Christmas day.
Okay, this did happen on Christmas morning. We, as I said, the neighbors weren't real close, but close enough if somebody got scared and was hollering, you could hear them. So the Daddy and the boys had already got to the barn to feed the livestock and milk. And we heard somebody hollering, "Mad Dog, Mad Dog, Mad Dog." Mad Dog is mad dog for a dog that has rabies. So we were all really excited and scared, and I remember us getting on the front porch, and I remember seeing the dog. It was a white bulldog, and it went through our front yard. But it was time Daddy could get to the house and get the rifle loaded, or the shotgun, whichever, the dog was gone. But so we were all congregated on the front porch, and we heard this noise, this blamming, this really, and we looked, uh-oh, where's Mama? We had forgotten about Mama. And she was in the outhouse when she heard all this commotion. She was afraid to stay, but she was afraid to run to the house because it was quite a distance. You didn't have an outhouse right close to the house. So, but she, instead of coming to the door, we had two back doors, she came to the one that had not been open that morning. We didn't lock doors, but Dad had a button that he would fix on a nail, and we would, put that over the door. But she was so scared, she knocked that button off. And
She practically knocked down the door.
She was not too happy with her because we had forgotten about her and the excitement.
Well, what happened to the mad dog?
Well, when we went to Grandma's, we went on to Grandma's, but Daddy carried the rifle with him. And we didn't hear about it for a good while, but some way or another, that dog circled around from Harbin's and wound up close to Decula, and Mr. Other Smith, it was in his yard, and he shot it. So that was
It's the end of
that.
the
That was the
mad dog.
end of the Mad Dog story.
But y'all didn't have a medical emergency then, but if you had, what would you have done?
Well, it could get kind of, it was hard because we had doctors in towns. We had doctors in Lawrenceville, Decula, and Winder, but they were not that easy to get to. And if you had to go to a hospital for some major reason, you had to go to Atlanta, to Georgia Baptist or Crawford Long. And there were no hospitals anywhere around. And so it could get kind of scary sometimes.
Well, Uncle Dewey did have a medical emergency once.
Yes.
How did y'all handle that?
Well, I was, as I said, still real little. Dewey was at home. He was still working in the cotton patch, and he had a basket of cotton. And the baskets were big once you emptied your pick sack that you wore over your, to pick cotton,
your shoulder.
put your cotton in. And so the only way you could carry it was to prop it up on your shoulder and then hold it the best you could. And so he was putting it in the cotton house where Daddy would keep track of it until he had a bale and to make a bale of cotton. So there was a step up, and someone other Dewey's foot slipped. And when he came down, his knee hit the step, the edge of the step. It knocked his kneecap all the way over on the side of his leg. I can remember how it looked, and he was in horrible pain. All we had was a wagon and a horse. I mean, how could we get him to a doctor fast? Well, Daddy went across the pasture, and this was, it just happened. A friend of Dewey's that had already, a little older, had already gotten out and got a public job and had bought a car, came immediately and got him to a doctor. And the doctor was on the second floor, and a man there nearby saw the situation, and I reckon it gave him adrenaline because he picked Dewey up. Dewey was 6'4", and carried him up the stairs.
Wow.
And the doctor got it put back in place.
I'm glad it had a happy ending. But that shows how transportation played a big part in or could be a real issue if there was an emergency. So how did that impact Uncle Dewey and jobs and all of that if you just had a horse and buggy or a horse and wagon?
Well, after Dewey and Harold, they had already graduated, and they were in the field picking cotton one day, and evidently was close to the road, and this car came along and stopped, and it was a man from Boney Island in Beaufort, and he was looking.
That was a leather place, was it?
Yes.
A place where they made saddles and things like that?
Yes. But they, talking to Harold Dewey, he hired them on the spot. And of course, them not having a car, they had to room and board at Beaufort. But they bought a car, together, they bought a 34 Chevrolet, and they would come home on weekends. And, but then it closed for some reason. I think it must have closed, and I'm not real sure about this, but because of the war, they needed the leather for other things other than saddles and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. So they moved back home, and Harold got a job at the shoe shop, General Shoe, in Lawrenceville, which was the main industry at that time. And so Dewey was still working on the farm, but he had then he got, that's where we get into the war issue, right?
Yeah. Well, I just was wanting to know, really, if that was difficult to get around like that. How did you get to school?
Oh, school, well, at one time, this was kind of for my time, a man in the community owned a private bus, and he did a route for the county, but then the county bought their own buses, but I never hardly got to ride one. We lived on the main road, but the bus didn't come by my house. It turned before it got to my house, and then went back in the country and come out down below us. But a teacher of mine, Miss Agnes, and we called our teachers Miss. It was not being rude or anything. That's the way we did back then. In fact, people call me Miss Fay now. I've gotten old enough to. But she would come by every day, and I rode with her. So, of course, I was kind of labeled a teacher's pet. But just lost her this past July. She was 98 years old.
And you still were in touch with her?
Yes.
Just about every day. Well, what was school like once you got there?
Well, we had we had a primer, which was a forerunner of kindergarten. So we had primer and the first grade in one room with one teacher. The third and fourth was in another room with one teacher. And Mr. Hope Sims had 3 classes, the 5th, 6th, and 7th, and those were hard grades. But then the 8th and 9th, but a few years later, in fact, before I got to the 8th grade, they had dropped it down to 7 grades. So when I got to the 8th grade, we had to go to Decula to school. And that's, basketball at Decula was a
Before you go into that,
big
what
thing.
about grades? That was something really significant with your grade at Decula High School.
About the, being the,
First.
okay, yes. They had determined, before I graduated, they had determined that kids were graduating too young. So where they had formerly went through 11 grades, they made it 12 grades. So my class happened to be the first 12th grade. So there was no graduating class in 1952. And a lot of people don't know this, but it's something you might not be aware of unless you had some kind of reason
Connection
to know
to
about
it.
it, connection.
Yeah.
But basketball was a big thing then. We didn't have football. Football didn't even come till maybe 10 or 12 years later.
Actually, it didn't come till I was in high school, which was a lot later.
And but we were good. In fact, when my brothers played, they played on dirt courts. They didn't have a gym. But when I was in high school, we did get to go to Macon to the state tournament. The year I was a senior, we didn't win, but the next year after we left, they did win the state tournament. And so
Did you
it was
play
No,
basketball,
I was too awkward, but I was a cheerleader. But the cheerleading outfits were not like they are today. The skirts came down to mid-thigh, mid-calf, and they were heavy corduroy lined with satin, gold satin, and they were so cold. I mean, back then even the gyms didn't have heating. There might be a coal stove on one corner and then one on the opposite corner. So, you know, we had kind of primitive conditions sometimes. And we had the big sweaters with a big D, big blue D. And
Did y'all ever do any fundraisers or things like that?
yeah, we had a lot of plays. Even back at Harbin's, we had plays, and it was a big community thing. We would have plays to raise money and different events at the school. And then plays we had contests, you know, and about plays and things and music and stuff like that involved the whole county. And
I think you have a story about Uncle Harold in one of those plays.
yeah, this was back, I mean, you know, before my time, but I remember about it. They had a play called Here Comes Charlie, and my brother was playing an old man. I mean, he was dressed up like an old man, and he talked, you know, real old. And so evidently they were so good, they went to other schools to put the play on, and each school had to furnish the furniture that was needed for the stage. And so Harold was, you know, he was kind of a big shot. He was, they had a rocker, and he was supposed to lean back in the rocker, you know, like he was really something. And the rocker was broken, and he flipped over. He turned a somersault, but he got up.
He acted like it
He
was a
acted
part
like
of the
it
play?
was part of the play, yes.
That's funny.
And
Well, being a graduate of Decula is pretty special for our family, isn't it?
yes, my brothers graduated from there. All my kids and all my grandkids which I have 5, and all of them graduated from Decula except one granddaughter. So it's a pretty special place to me.
Well, it sounds like the school in Harbins was an important part of the community. You were talking about the community would turn out for your plays. Was there another focal point where you got a real sense of community?
Certainly. Our church. We only had church about a couple of Sundays a month, but people really turned out. And I remember Daddy would give us a penny for a donation to our Sunday school class. But we didn't have the Christmas programs at church. They were at school. We would have Christmas programs at school, but we had some big events. The first Sunday in June was all-day singing and dinner on the grounds. And I remember we had a long row of tables, and people really came because some of the people, as I said, had gotten public jobs and moved out of the community, but it gave them a chance to come back and visit, and so it was really a big event. Mm-hmm. And then in August, we had revival, a week of revival. This was set up before the farmers had to start picking cotton and all that kind of stuff. And so people would, that was a big event too. Our church was a wooden church, and it, seats all pointing congregated toward the altar, but there was a big center spot right in front of the altar. But they would open the doors of the church, and by this, every time there was a service,
wait.
This
now,
would
what
give
do you
an,
mean
I
by
know.
open the doors of the church?
This would be what they call when people would come forward to that they had proclaimed Jesus as their Savior and they wanted to join the church and be a member. Well, because of no facilities or anything like that, they had to wait until, even if they did it back in January, they had to wait until August to be baptized. And there was a cement pool that was built in Mr. Lon Etheridge's pasture. So there would be so many people that had to be baptized that when they went back to the church to recognize the people, the big place in front of the pulpit wouldn't even hold them. They had to go outside, and we gave them, the church would go around and give them we called it the right hand of Christian fellowship, where they would shake hands with them and welcome them to the church. So church was a big part of our lives.
I bet it was even more important to the community when World War II started. How did that impact Harbins and Gwinnett County? Were there any casualties from Harbins?
Well, it affected all of Gwinnett County. But I remember, and I know of, and when I was kind of researching the book, I made sure of what I could find out to be true. There was only one casualty in the immediate area of Harbins. And when they received the news about this, an officer came to tell the family about it, and they were in church. They came to the church to find them.
They actually told them at church?
Uh-huh. And there was a couple of boys that were really hurt bad, but as a whole, all the families, came back okay.
No, that's a blessing.
Yeah.
You're very fortunate.
My brothers had been drafted, but they were both turned down for different reasons. But later on, but before I get to that, one of my brothers had to go to Crawford Long Hospital for an emergency appendectomy operation, and this was really something back then. And on the way back, we had to stop because they had blackout. We had to park. They had blackouts back then. It affected the cities so much more than the country because of the cities being so full of lights and all.
So
But
now
I
you're
do-
talking about blackouts,
Blackouts.
so that if they were going to be bombed,
Yes,
they would,
yes,
would
they
have
had to.
blackouts if they thought there
And
was
it was
a threat.
very serious in the city. They had to have black curtains that, and they were wardens that would go around and check people.
And you had to stop and actually turn the car lights on.
Yes, yes, and wait till we got an all clear.
Wow.
But then Dewey, after he got better, and after that he was drafted again, and he passed this time, and he became a Marine. He went to Parris Island, South Carolina. He was a big old guy, but he had phlebitis, which is trouble in his legs. So the marching and all that kept him in the infirmary more than, you know, he was able to train. So we had planned a trip to go see him. And you remember, this is like, I had only been to maybe Grant Park and Stone Mountain, and I was quite young, and so I was really looking forward to it. Well, before we could go, get the trip ready, Dewey came home with an honorable discharge. And I was so mad at him, I wouldn't speak to him. Because
He spoiled your
I would
trip.
catch
Did y'all have any rationing or
Oh,
anything
yes.
like that?
We had rationing. They had rationing board, and this also was very strict. And they, the things that were, there were several things that had to be rationed, but sugar, coffee, meat, shoes, because of the leather, several things that you could only get, you had to do per coupon. And gas was one of the biggest things that was rationed. If you were a doctor or certain government officials, you had unlimited gas. But if you only needed it to work, to go to work and that kind of thing, you could get up to 21 gallons of gas. Now this is a week. And if for non-essential people, only 3 gallons of gas a week. So can you imagine that today? With as
I
many
think we're-
cars as on the road.
I think we're pretty spoiled.
But also something else happened, and we never knew if this, it was never proven if this had anything to do with the war or not. There was some people that, we didn't really have protesters back then, but there were some people that didn't quite agree with the war, so it was a speculation. Several schools burned in 1944. Decula burned, Lawrenceville burned, Grayson burned, and in trying to find out more about it, I also found that Flowery Branch burned, Winder burned. So they did prove that it was arson. They were all set, but they never were able to prove, or didn't have the facilities to prove, if it had anything to do with the war or not. But it did happen while the war was going on.
I bet that was really a major
Yes,
event and a major mystery to this day.
yeah, one of my former teachers that I talked to was a senior the year Decula burned, and she said they had to they graduated in April because this was high school and grammar school together, so there were quite a few kids involved, and they had to just put them wherever they could find empty spaces to hold class.
Well, Mama, you have shared a lot about the way things were, or the way things used to be. How do you feel about having grown up in Gwinnett County?
Well, I look back on those days and I find I feel thankful for the way I grew up. It was a good time, and a good place to spend my childhood. The church, school, and the community spirit was exceptional. I'm proud and I feel very blessed to have been a part of Harbin's, Tequila, and Gwinnett County.